Hello friends, I won't take much of your time. I just ask you to subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I've always hated speeches at family gatherings. Not because I have stage fright or anything dramatic like that. No, it's because they always come with a side of humiliation, served cold and with wine-stained smiles. But nothing, not even the decades of passive-aggressive jabs, or the years of being the emotional punching bag, prepared me for the moment when my parents stood up, glasses raised, at my brother Luke's 30th birthday party and declared, "One child made us proud. The other, well, she tried." I laughed. Loud, actually. Not the polite kind of chuckle you force out when someone forgets your name at Thanksgiving, but the kind of sharp, cracked laugh that slips out when your mask finally fractures. I think it startled people, but not nearly as much as what came next. The party was held at this upscale restaurant in Stamford, Connecticut, the kind with 3 types of forks and servers who pretend not to eavesdrop when the family drama starts boiling. Luke was grinning like he was on stage, eating up the attention like he always did. Our parents were dressed in coordinated navy, like some aging prom couple. Everything looked picture perfect on the surface, which has always been their thing. But for me, the cracks had been showing for years. Growing up, I was the responsible one. That's what they called it. It sounded like a compliment until I realized it just meant I could be ignored while they cleaned up Luke's messes. I was the kid who got straight A's without needing tutors, who helped with chores without being asked, who cried silently when they forgot my birthday. Twice. Luke, on the other hand, was the golden child before he even learned to tie his shoes. He got applause for showing up. I got silence for exceeding expectations. I moved out at 20, started working odd jobs while putting myself through college. No one offered help. When I launched my first startup at 27, my mother told me not to get too excited. When I made my first 6 figures, my dad said, "That's nice, but are you sure it's sustainable?" Meanwhile, Luke got a job in finance straight out of college, an internship handed to him by one of Dad's golf buddies. And when he was promoted a year later, there was a whole dinner party dedicated to Luke's incredible drive. I learned early to stop trying to impress them, but a part of me, an embarrassingly stubborn, bruised part, still wanted to be seen. So when they stood up at his party, I already knew I wasn't going to be mentioned. I told myself to just smile, sip my overpriced cocktail, and let it roll off. But then my mother cleared her throat, and my dad grinned in that smug, "I'm about to be hilarious" way, and they said it. That line, that disgusting, dismissive line, like a slap wrapped in a joke. One child made us proud, the other, well, she tried. The room erupted in laughter. I think most of them didn't even realize I was the other until they saw my face. Or maybe they did, and they laughed anyway, because that's the role I was assigned a long time ago. The overlooked one, the cautionary tale, the girl who never quite lived up to her potential. I put down my drink. My hands weren't shaking, not even a little. Something inside me had finally settled into place. Not anger, not sadness, something colder, a kind of clarity. So I stood up, smiling, calm. I pulled out my phone and tapped a few times. The screen glowed in the dim light. Then I raised my voice, just loud enough to cut through the post-toast chuckles. "Want to see what Forbes just published?" I said. Everything stopped. Conversations, forks midair, even the background music. It was like someone had hit pause on the entire room. My mother's eyes narrowed, confused. My father leaned forward slightly, like I was about to tell a joke that might not be funny. And Luke? He just watched me, not surprised, not confused. Just waiting. I turned the screen around. The headline glared back at them, bold and unmistakable. Anonymous founder of billion-dollar tech startup, revealed. Meet Emily Carter. Aunt Jean, God bless her, let out a low whistle. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering against the hardwood floor. And still, Luke didn't blink. The silence was exquisite. I didn't say another word. I just let it sink in. The reality that the daughter who tried had quietly built something massive, something undeniable, while they were too busy clapping for mediocrity. And that was just the beginning. The thing people never seem to understand about silence is that it isn't neutral. Sometimes silence is heavy. It fills a room, settles into people's lungs, presses against the back of their throats like a second heartbeat. That was the kind of silence that followed the words I'd just said. The only sound, apart from the slow clink of wine glass shards sliding across the floor, was the quiet buzz of my phone screen glowing in my hand, the headlines still shining like a spotlight no one expected. I didn't move. I didn't need to. I had learned a long time ago that when you finally drop a truth that no one believed you were even capable of holding, you don't explain it. You let it speak for itself. So I stood there, letting the room stew in its discomfort, holding up the glowing proof that the girl they'd dismissed as flaky and distracted and overambitious had quietly changed the rules of the game without ever asking for their approval. The headline was short and impossible to misinterpret. Anonymous founder of billion-dollar tech startup revealed, meet Emily Carter. It had been published only 3 hours earlier. I had known it would drop that day, but I hadn't known the timing would land so perfectly, like fate had finally decided to send me a personal invitation to deliver my overdue reckoning. The article was full of details they never bothered to learn about me. It talked about how my company had started as a side project in my one-bedroom apartment in Queens, something I built after my 9-to-5 job while everyone else was out drinking or complaining about how hard it was to get ahead. It explained how I stayed anonymous, how I used my middle name professionally, Elaine Carter, and kept my face out of press releases, letting my work speak instead. It highlighted the AI software we built that disrupted customer experience platforms across half the Fortune 500, and how venture capitalists had been begging me to reveal myself for over a year. I hadn't wanted to, but the board insisted once we hit the billion-dollar valuation. They wanted a face, a founder, someone they could parade around at conferences. And now there I was, and this air in the restaurant had turned syrupy and strange. I could feel people trying to reconcile the image of me, quiet, polite, borderline invisible, with the woman in the Forbes article who had built an empire behind the scenes. It wasn't computing, and that pleased me in a way I couldn't fully describe. My mother, still frozen in place, stared down at the shattered wine glass, as though it held the answer to a question she'd never thought to ask. My father blinked rapidly, a twitch he got when he was uncomfortable but trying not to show it. His mouth opened like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. For once, the man who always had a dismissive remark or a quick redirect had been rendered speechless. It was Luke who broke the tension first. He let out a low, almost amused breath, then leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, as if he'd been expecting this to happen all along. That detail, more than anything, unsettled me. While everyone else looked stunned or embarrassed or visibly recalibrating their view of me, my golden boy brother looked entertained, like he had just watched a magic trick and wanted to see the encore. He raised one eyebrow, gave me a small nod that might have been approval, or maybe it was acknowledgement. We locked eyes for a second longer than was comfortable, and I had the strange, disorienting feeling that he wasn't surprised. Not at all. I didn't know what to make of that. The thing about Luke is, he's always been slippery. Not evil, not cruel, just frustratingly good at moving through life with the confidence of someone who'd never had to earn it. We weren't close, not really, but we had a weird, unspoken understanding. I wouldn't compete with him, and he wouldn't acknowledge that I was competition. Until now, that dynamic had worked. But standing there, holding my phone like a mic drop, something had shifted, and I couldn't tell if it scared him or excited him. The rest of the room slowly resumed motion. People coughed, murmured, made that awkward social attempt at returning to normal conversation. But there was no normal left to return to. Aunt Jean, bless her chaotic heart, clapped once, slow and deliberate, before saying loudly, "Well, that explains why she never returned my casserole dish." Her humor broke the tension just enough for the murmuring to resume, but I could feel the questions circling like sharks beneath the surface. Nobody knew what to say to me, and I didn't make it easier for them. I just sat back down, took a sip of my drink, and waited for someone to ask what they really wanted to know. It didn't take long. My mother, recovering just enough to put on her artificial composure, leaned across the table and said too sweetly, "Emily, why didn't you ever tell us about all of this?" Her tone made it sound like I'd kept a juicy secret for fun, like I was playing some petty game of hide and seek instead of protecting myself from their withering doubt for over a decade. I smiled, teeth and all. "You never asked," I said. That wasn't the whole truth, but it was the sharpest part of it. They hadn't asked because they hadn't wanted to know. They'd written me off before I ever had a chance to explain who I really was. Dad cleared his throat and tried to pivot, probably already strategizing how to spin this in a way that made them seem supportive. "That's impressive, Emily. Really? So this is like real money?" he asked. Like I might still be exaggerating or misinformed about the value of the company I had built from scratch. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, Dad, it's real. The kind of real where people return my calls now, even when they don't like what I'm saying." He gave a stiff smile, then looked down at his plate. The conversation was over, for now. But there were undercurrents now, things that couldn't be unsaid or ignored. I had changed the narrative in less than 5 minutes, and no one knew what to do with that. As the night wore on, I stayed quiet. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain. I let the discomfort do the work for me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or messy. Sometimes it's just the truth, delivered in full daylight, while everyone else is still clinging to the version of you they thought they understood. But what unsettled me the most wasn't my parents' confusion or the way family friends suddenly started asking me about venture capital with a mix of awe and opportunism. It was Luke, still watching me, still unreadable, still smiling in that faint, knowing way. It wasn't until I got home later that night, when I checked my email and saw a message from him with the subject line, "Congrats, finally," that I realized he had known more than he ever let on. And if Luke had known, what else had my family kept quiet about? Something didn't add up, and I intended to find out exactly what it was. The next morning, the glow of the reveal had worn off a bit, replaced by something less satisfying, something heavier and harder to swallow. It wasn't regret, not exactly, but it also wasn't victory. I'd imagined that proving myself would come with a wave of relief, maybe even peace. But what I got instead was a series of lukewarm text messages, a couple of confused emails, and a voicemail from my mother that started with, "Emily, call us when you get a chance," and ended with, "We're just a little surprised, that's all." No apology, no recognition that what they'd said at the party had been cruel. Just surprise, as if I'd tricked them by succeeding without their permission. I didn't call her back. Instead, I listened to the message 3 times and then deleted it. There was a strange satisfaction in doing that. Just erasing her voice from my phone, the way she'd spent years trying to erase any part of me that didn't fit into her neat little box of expectations. Later that afternoon, my father called. He never called. Even when I lived just 2 hours away, even when I graduated with honors, even when I bought my first apartment, he never picked up the phone. But suddenly, here he was, my phone buzzing with his name like some ghost from a life I'd spent years trying to outgrow. I almost let it go to voicemail, but curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to hear what excuse he'd come up with. "Hey, Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral, like we were 2 people who barely knew each other, which, in a lot of ways, was the truth. His voice, always controlled and clipped, sounded just a little too casual. "Emily, your mother and I, we wanted to talk about everything." "Everything," I repeated. "That's a big category." He paused. "We saw the article. Obviously, it's impressive." "Thanks." Another pause. "We had no idea things had taken off like that. You never told us." I let the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. "No, I didn't. You were always working on something, and we just assumed it was freelancing or consulting or one of your, projects." There it was, that word, projects. My whole life had been reduced to a handful of vague, condescending labels they slapped on anything they didn't understand or care to ask about. Freelancing, projects, hobbies. Meanwhile, Luke could start a half-baked podcast and get a write-up in the family Christmas letter. I took a slow breath. Dad, I told you years ago I was building something. You said I should get a real job before I fell too far behind. He didn't argue. He just cleared his throat like maybe the truth was scratching at it. Look, Emily, I know we haven't always been the most attentive when it comes to your work, but we're proud of you, truly. I didn't believe him, not really, and I think he knew that. You can't spend over 3 decades ignoring someone and then expect a couple of words to rewrite the past. So why didn't you comment? I asked. What? For the article. Forbes reached out. They told me. They asked if you wanted to give a statement. You didn't. He went quiet for a moment. Your mother thought it might be better not to say anything. We didn't want to embarrass you. That made me laugh, cold and bitter. You embarrassed me every chance you got, but that was the moment you decided to keep quiet? I think this conversation's getting a little emotional, he muttered, and I could practically see him reaching for the mental exit, that same old instinct to shut things down the second they became uncomfortable. Don't worry, I said. We're done. And I hung up. Over the next few days, things got weird. I received a sudden influx of friend requests from people I hadn't spoken to since high school, some congratulatory messages from old professors, and even a few emails from my parents' friends who wanted to connect me with their grandchildren who were interested in tech. But beneath the noise, beneath the awkward compliments and fake excitement, I could feel something else brewing. There was a quietness to Luke that unsettled me, a distance that wasn't quite disapproval, but wasn't support either. It was like he was watching something play out behind the scenes that I hadn't been invited to see. Then late one night, I got a call from Aunt Jean. Don't hang up, she said quickly, like she already knew I was tired of people pretending to care. I didn't say anything. I heard something, she continued, from your father. He was talking to Tom Mulligan, you know, the accountant who does their taxes. And he mentioned that he always knew you were smart, but he didn't think you'd get this far without them. Without them, Emily. My throat went dry. What's that supposed to mean? I don't know, but it sounded weird. Like they'd, I don't know, tried to manage something on your behalf? It didn't make sense. They'd never supported me, not financially, not emotionally, not even in name. They hadn't invested in my company. They didn't know any of my mentors. I'd built every inch of my success without their help. Unless they had tried to insert themselves into my story without telling me. Maybe they had seen my name in early filings. Maybe someone at the bank tipped them off when I started making larger deposits. Maybe they had looked up my LLC when they got curious. That was the moment I started going through my old emails, digging through documents, receipts, anything that might tell me just how deep their silence had gone. I found something. A request from 2 years ago from a journalist I'd ignored at the time, asking for a comment on the identity of E. Carter, the founder of the then unnamed startup that was beginning to make waves. She had said she reached out to the listed Carter family members connected by surname on public business records. That meant someone had already been contacted, and someone had chosen not to tell me. It was more than silence now. It was secrecy. It was complicity. I realized then that this wasn't about them overlooking me anymore. This was about them hiding me, and I wasn't about to let that go. When people talk about betrayal, they usually describe it as something sudden, a knife in the back, a jarring realization, a sharp rupture in trust that appears all at once and tears through everything you thought you knew. But in my case, betrayal wasn't an explosion. It was quiet, procedural, written in legal language, and buried in financial paperwork that no one ever expected me to read. It didn't shout, it whispered. After that call with Aunt Jean, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling in my Manhattan apartment, watching shadows shift across the walls, while my mind ran laps around the question I couldn't let go of. What else had they kept from me? Not in the obvious, dismissive way they always had, but in the hidden, calculated way that people use when they know they're doing something wrong, but convince themselves it's for the greater good. Or worse, that they're entitled to it. The next morning, still hollow from lack of sleep, I emailed my lawyer. He was the kind of guy who wore the same gray suit every day and drank espresso like it was a competitive sport. We'd worked together since the earliest days of my startup, and though I rarely needed his input now that the company had a legal team, I trusted him with the stuff I didn't want making it into official channels. I asked him to pull any historical records tied to my name, anything that might show familial financial transactions, college funds, trusts, loans, property rights, anything. I told him to dig and to not stop until he hit concrete. What I expected was a confirmation of what I already knew, that my parents had ignored me financially just like they had emotionally, that they'd never lifted a finger to support my ambitions, and that all their so-called shock at my success was just thinly disguised bitterness at having no part in it. But what I got was something else entirely. 2 days later, I was sitting in a coffee shop near my office when my lawyer called. His voice was calm, but there was a strange edge to it, the kind of tone that said, "I have something to tell you, and you're not going to like it." "I found something," he said plainly. "It's a trust, set up shortly after your high school graduation, funded initially from what appears to be your 529 college savings plan." I blinked. "What are you talking about? I had a scholarship. That money should have sat there until I needed it for grad school or whatever." "Right," he said. "But according to the paperwork, your parents moved the funds, legally, into a different trust under your last name, with a secondary beneficiary named Luke Carter." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're telling me they took my college fund and handed it over to Luke?" "Not directly. It's a little murky. They established a family trust, named both you and Luke as primary family beneficiaries, but within the details, they listed the fund as being reallocated in favor of the younger sibling due to scholarship coverage of the elder. There's a clause indicating mutual consent. And here's where it gets complicated. It includes what looks like your digital signature. I didn't say anything for a long time. The noises of the cafe, espresso machines hissing, chairs scraping across tile, faded into the background like static. My signature. They had used my signature. "I never signed anything," I finally said. "Not for that, not ever." "I figured," he said quietly. "It looks like they used a scanned signature. It's embedded, not original, likely copied from old school documents or medical forms. Not impossible to challenge, but you'd need to prove it was used without your knowledge." I stared out the window, watching a group of teenagers pile into a bus, laughing about something that felt a million miles away from where I was. All those years I had assumed they were just negligent, just emotionally unavailable or casually cruel in that middle-class suburban way that passes for discipline. But this was different. This was planned. This was paperwork, signatures, legal transactions, and deliberate redirection of resources, under the assumption that I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care. "They stole from me," I said slowly, like saying it aloud might help me believe it. "In a sense, yes," he said. "Legally, it's complicated. Morally, not so much." It all started making a sick kind of sense. Luke's apartment in Tribeca, that he always insisted was a deal through a family friend, the job that required no resume, the startup he abandoned halfway through but somehow walked away from without debt. The dinners, the vacations, the financial cushions that I had assumed came from charm or luck or connections. No, it was my money. It had always been my money. I remembered one night, maybe 5 years ago, when I had been staying with my parents for Christmas. I'd brought up the idea of applying for a business grant and mentioned that I might need bank statements from my childhood accounts to prove financial independence. My mother had changed the subject so fast, I didn't even question it at the time. Now I could see the puzzle forming. Now the picture was coming together. I called Aunt Jean again that night. I needed someone to say it wasn't all in my head. "They forged it?" she asked, stunned. "Are you absolutely sure?" "I'm sure enough to be pissed," I said, pacing my living room like I was trying to outwalk my own fury. They repackaged my future and handed it to Luke with a bow, then acted like he was some kind of prodigy for not screwing it up. Aunt Jean was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. You know they've always protected him. But this is another level. I had spent so many years convincing myself that they just didn't see me, that I was just overlooked, a background character in their story. I had never even considered that they might have actively stolen from me. Not until now. I sat down and pulled out a yellow legal pad, the kind I hadn't used in years. I started making a list. What I knew, what I could prove, what questions I needed answered. I wasn't going to explode. I wasn't going to scream. I was going to do what I had always done, work in silence, build a case, and deliver the truth in a way they couldn't ignore. This time, there would be no forgiveness, no polite conversation, no letting them explain it away with weak apologies and excuses about what they thought was best. This time, there would be consequences. And I was going to make sure the next thing they lost wasn't just my silence, but their legacy. They wanted to rewrite my story? Fine. But they forgot who holds the pen now. There's a moment, just before revenge becomes real, when everything stands still. Not because you're unsure of what to do, but because you finally realize that the power has shifted. That you now hold something they can't take back. Something they can't unsee, undo, or explain away. It doesn't feel triumphant, not at first. It feels quiet, steady, cold, like standing at the top of a hill you've been climbing your whole life, only to find the view doesn't give you the closure you thought it would. But still, you stand there and you look down, and you decide it's time to start the fire. After the discovery about the trust fund, the forgery, the money rerouted behind my back, the years of lies, I gave myself exactly 1 weekend to feel every ounce of anger, grief, and betrayal that had been building in me since I was a teenager. I went on long walks through the city, sometimes for hours, not even thinking, just moving, letting the noise and chaos around me drown out the screaming in my head. I didn't call anyone. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't even touch the stack of legal documents my lawyer had delivered, now sitting on my kitchen counter like a bomb waiting to go off. I just let it all burn inside me. And when Monday came, I was no longer furious. I was focused. There's a very specific kind of satisfaction that comes from realizing you can ruin someone's reputation without raising your voice. I didn't want a messy lawsuit, not yet. That would come later if necessary. What I wanted was to take the thing they had always clung to, their name, their pride, their illusion of superiority, and fracture it in a way that would never quite heal. I wanted them to feel small. I wanted them to be forced to reckon with the version of me they tried so hard to ignore, now standing taller than their legacy. So I began with something simple, something public. I worked with my team to launch a new philanthropic branch of my company, one I had planned to build eventually, but now had a far more personal mission. We called it Project Tried. A little nod to my mother's toast, the one that started it all. The tagline was blunt, a little sharp, and unmistakably mine. For the women who were told they just tried. We funded scholarships for girls in STEM, launched mentorship programs for women founders, and created a startup incubator specifically for entrepreneurs from unsupportive families. The announcement went live with a press release that quoted me directly. Success doesn't require permission, and talent doesn't always come wrapped in family approval. It was subtle enough to pass as generic inspiration, but anyone who knew me, and especially anyone who knew them, would catch the subtext like a brick through glass. It exploded online. LinkedIn, Twitter, even mainstream media picked it up within hours. The article was shared across tech networks, women's leadership groups, and entrepreneurship circles. Emails poured in. Venture capitalists I'd once had to beg for meetings were suddenly praising my vision. Former classmates sent messages like, "Finally, I always knew you were going to do something huge." It was flattering, sure, but none of it mattered nearly as much as the email I received 2 days later. An anonymous tip sent from an encrypted address. It contained a scanned document labeled simply, Carter Trust Reallocation. Attached was a note. You didn't just lose your money, they forged your rights. It was worse than we thought. Not only had my parents used my name to justify reallocating the funds to Luke, But they had also used a notary who wasn't present during the signing, someone whose license had expired the year before the documents were supposedly filed. It was a paper trail, sloppy and arrogant, and it was enough to make a legal case that wouldn't just cost them money, it would cost them their credibility, their professional standing, and the image they spent decades carefully curating. I brought it to my lawyer. He reviewed everything twice, then looked up at me across his desk. "If we move forward," he said, "we're talking depositions, press, court records. They'll fight it, and it'll get ugly." "I know," I said, and I meant it. But they crossed the line, and they thought I wouldn't find out. They thought I'd stay quiet. He leaned back in his chair. "They're going to lose more than just money. I'm counting on it." But I didn't file the case. Not yet. I wanted them to squirm first. I wanted them to hear the whispers, to be invited to fewer social events, to see the subtle shifts in how their friends looked at them once they put two and two together. I wanted them to feel what it was like to be spoken of in hushed tones, to become the subject of speculation instead of celebration. So I took it one step further. I gave an interview, a long, calm, unflinching conversation with a podcast that focused on women in leadership. I told my story, not with rage, not with revenge in my voice, but with clarity. I spoke about being undermined, about being underestimated, and about what happens when you stop waiting for permission to succeed. I didn't name names. I didn't have to. Anyone who knew our family history could connect the dots, and they did. The fallout was slow, but it was unmistakable. My parents stopped showing up at community events. Their friends stopped tagging them in photos. Luke's firm issued a generic statement about integrity and restructured their family investment policies. And yet Luke himself didn't lash out, didn't protest, didn't even call me. He just sent another email, this one with no subject line and no body, just a single link to an old photo of us as kids, sitting on a swing set, me pushing him while he laughed. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't make me feel nostalgic. It made me feel nothing. Eventually, I stood outside their house again. It was early spring, the air still cool, but the sky beginning to turn the color of possibility. I hadn't planned to be there, not really. My car just seemed to turn in that direction, like muscle memory had taken the wheel. I parked down the street and walked the last block, past the hydrangeas my mother always bragged about, past the cracked driveway my father never fixed, until I stood in front of the porch I had once been sent to sit on, after telling the truth too loudly. In my hand was a letter, not an apology, not an explanation, just a statement of what I knew, what I remembered, and what I'd never forgive. I considered putting it in the mailbox, slipping it into the door frame, even taping it to the window. But instead, I stood there for a long time, the letter slowly crumpling in my grip, and I made a choice. I dropped it into the trash bin beside the sidewalk, turned, and walked away. Not because they didn't deserve to hear it, but because I didn't need them to. They had spent their lives chasing pride, mistaking it for love. But pride without love is just vanity, and I had built something real, something lasting. I didn't need their validation. I never had. And maybe, just maybe, that was the best revenge of all.